Young Caroline Norton, barely 19 years old, her hand quivering, made her final mark. In the subdued glow of St. George's Church, she pressed her pen to the aged parchment, the scratch of metal on paper, an amplified echo against the ancient stone. Outside, church bells pealed a triumphant fanfare, a stark contrast to the solemnity within. Each letter she formed was etched with the gravity of one penning their own final testament. The year was 1827. Morning summer light fractured into a kaleidoscope of hues by the stained glass windows, painted the marriage register in vibrant hues. Her new husband, George Norton, stood nearby, his gaze impatient, already asserting his claim. Witnesses offered hushed congratulations, their smiles genuine. Caroline's mother discreetly wiped away tears of happiness. Unbeknownst to any in that consecrated space, they were observing not a union, but a legal abolition. As Caroline withdrew her pen from her maiden name, she was utterly unaware that she had just surrendered her very being. That signature, intended to solidify a bond of love, had instead codified her transformation from an individual into mere chattel. From that precise moment, Caroline Norton ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. She had been remade into something else entirely, something that could be possessed, commanded, and discarded at will. Before the ink had even fully dried, her legal demise had commenced. How could the most sacred of vows devolve into a death sentence? And why did Victorian society contort matrimony into a legal form of murder? You may believe you understand the constraints women endured in bygone eras, but the truth was far more chilling than even the most candid historical accounts reveal. To comprehend how Caroline Norton entered that church as a person and emerged as property, we must delve into the intricate machinery of marital annihilation. And rest assured, the reality is more harrowing than you can possibly conceive. The instant the church bells ceased their ringing, she vanished. Not in a figurative sense, nor a romantic one, but in a legal one. The principle bore a deceptively refined name: coverture. Make no mistake, however, this was systematic erasure. The very moment Caroline uttered her marriage vows, every legal entitlement she possessed was transferred to her husband. Her assets, her earnings, her physical person, even her offspring, all now belong to him. The crucial point about coverture is this: it was not some antiquated relic from the Middle Ages. This was contemporary law in 1827, honed, perfected, and absolute. Legal scholars aptly termed it civil death, and they meant it with complete literalness. A married woman was legally incapacitated. She could not enter into contracts, possess property, or retain wages earned through employment. She could not even claim ownership of the very garments she wore. On the morning of her wedding, Caroline possessed the legal right to purchase property. By that afternoon, she could not legally buy a simple loaf of bread without her husband's explicit permission. That very morning, her testimony in a court of law would have been admissible. By that afternoon, her words held no legal standing. She had become what the law designated as a femme couverte, a covered woman. Covered signified obliteration. Covered meant possession. Yet the forfeiture of her name was merely the prelude. This profound alteration was orchestrated through specific legal frameworks. Foremost was the doctrine of unity of person, a legal fiction positing that husband and wife merged into a single entity, and that entity was invariably the husband. William Blackstone, the esteemed legal luminary, articulated this unequivocally. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. Suspended, as if holding her breath beneath the water's surface for decades. Following this was the transfer of property. All that Caroline owned, be it her dowry, her inheritance, her personal effects, even gifts from her own kin, instantly vested in George, not as joint ownership, but entirely and irrevocably his. Had she secreted gold coins within her jewelry box, they were now unequivocally his gold coins. If she had poured her soul into poetry within the privacy of her journals, every word was now his intellectual property. The law had a specific designation for her new status. She was now a chattel, personal property, akin to furniture or livestock. This comparison was not incidental. Legal treatises of that era routinely discussed wives in the same context as cattle and household goods. Both were subject to control, both could be subjected to discipline, and both belonged wholly to their proprietor. And the legal tribunals enforced this sentence of extinction with alacrity. In 1825, a mere 2 years prior to Caroline's wedding, a woman named Mary Giles attempted to sell vegetables harvested from her own garden to procure medicine for her ailing child. Her husband initiated legal proceedings against the merchant who had purchased them. The presiding judge ruled that, as a wife lacked the capacity to own property, she could not possess vegetables, even those cultivated by her own hand. The merchant was consequently compelled to reimburse the husband for acquiring what was deemed stolen goods. Goods stolen from a woman's own garden. The physical ceremony itself mirrored this transfer of dominion. The father gave away the bride, signifying her status as his property to transfer. The veil symbolized her concealment, her erasure. The ring served as a brand, marking her like livestock. Even the tradition of throwing rice at newlyweds carried symbolic weight. A blessing for fertility, for property expected to generate further property. And should Caroline have harbored any notion that her body remained her own, she would discover that very night that coverture extended to every facet of her physical being. A husband held absolute ownership over his wife's body. He could confine her to specific rooms, transport her wherever his fancy dictated, and demand access whenever he pleased. The law termed this conjugal rights, yet these rights flowed exclusively in one direction. She possessed no recourse to refuse, no claim to her own physical self. The marital chamber transformed into a legal arena where rape was, by definition, an impossibility. How could a man pilfer that which he already possessed? Such a question would have seemed preposterous to Victorian jurists, akin to inquiring if a man could rob his own coffers. Yet, what rendered coverture truly insidious was its presentation as a form of protection. Judges and legislators maintained that women required this covering for their own welfare, deemed too fragile for commerce, too pure for political engagement, too innocent for autonomy. This legal death was elegantly cloaked in chivalry, chains artfully disguised as courtesy. Religious authorities lent their blessings to this arrangement, proclaiming it divinely ordained. They preached that natural law necessitated it. To challenge coverture was to question the very fabric of creation. Sermons reminded brides that submission was sacred, that erasure was holy, and that civil death led to spiritual salvation. Caroline Norton stood in that church under the conviction that she was entering into a partnership. Instead, she was participating in her own legal funeral. The wedding guests showered them with rice and cheers, oblivious to the fact that they were celebrating an execution. The bride, clad in white, resembled a corpse prepared for its final resting place. But for Caroline Norton, this legal demise was soon to manifest in brutally tangible ways. George Norton sought not a partner, but an ephemeral being capable of procreation. The carriage ride from the church to their new abode consumed less than an hour. Within those 40 minutes, Caroline gleaned the full extent of what her signature had procured. George sat opposite her, already issuing dictates. No more composing poetry, no more engaging in political discourse, no more visits with her literary circle. The woman who had boarded that carriage, brimming with opinions and aspirations, was now expected to vanish instantly. Caroline Norton was no ordinary bride. Prior to her marriage, she had established herself as one of London's most promising young writers. Her lineage included Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the celebrated playwright. Literature was woven into her very essence. By the age of 18, she had contributed poetry to esteemed journals, earning comparisons to Byron from critics and attracting the attention of publishers. She possessed a voice, and England was beginning to acknowledge it. Within mere hours of the ceremony, Caroline would learn that this voice now belonged to George. He had been drawn to her at a social event, captivated by her beauty and the prominence of her connections. However, George Norton's motivations for marrying her were threefold, and affection was conspicuously absent. Firstly, her family name provided access to circles. His own unremarkable legal career could not penetrate. Secondly, her striking beauty would enhance his social standing. Thirdly, her body was intended to produce heirs, perpetuating his undistinguished lineage. Her intellect, that brilliant, restless mind capable of conjuring worlds through words, was considered an inconvenience to be managed. Like a spirited horse, she required breaking. George Norton approached this endeavor with calculated ruthlessness, initiating it that very first evening. The wedding night revealed George's strategy. He confiscated her writing materials first, ink, paper, even her personal correspondence, all secured in his private study. If she wished to communicate with her own mother, it would necessitate his consent and oversight. Every word she committed to paper would pass through his hands, every thought subject to his scrutiny and approval. But George had married her for these three specific reasons, and he intended to realize their full benefit. Next came the social isolation. The literary salons she had frequented were now off limits. The intellectual exchanges she craved were forbidden. When former acquaintances called, George turned them away. Invitations received were summarily incinerated. A proper wife, he believed, had no need for society beyond her husband's immediate circle, finding her fulfillment in subservience. Caroline attempted to reason with him, reminding him of her premarital contributions to household expenses through her writing. George's response demonstrated the futility of logic. Any income she generated was his by right. If he desired her earnings, he would instruct her to write. If not, she was to remain silent. The choice, however, was never hers to make. The initial night set the precedent for all subsequent events. George Norton subscribed to a philosophy of discipline. When Caroline spoke out of turn during a meal, he imposed silence upon her for an entire week. When she attempted to pilfer paper from his study, he confined her to their bedroom for 2 days. When she wept from loneliness, he dismissed her tears as manipulative and intensified her isolation. The woman who had walked into St. George's Church began to disintegrate, piece by piece. First, her voice was silenced, literally, through punitive measures. Then, her movement was restricted to designated areas and predetermined times. Her appearance followed suit. George dictated her attire, her hairstyle, even the expressions on her face. Excessive smiling suggested frivolity, a lack thereof indicated defiance. She learned to adopt a facade of placid contentment. However, the erasure extended beyond mere behavior. George commenced an alteration of her past. Her literary achievements were relegated to embarrassing episodes, never to be spoken of. Her familial connections were his to leverage. Her actual family, however, became strangers. He intercepted letters, refused visits, and disseminated the notion that she was too delicate for company, while privately portraying her as troublesome. The gifted young poet who entered into marriage transformed into a spectral presence, haunting her own existence. Servants reported hearing her pacing at night, the footsteps of a woman with no destination. Occasionally, they observed her moving her lips inaudibly, crafting verses she was unable to commit to paper. Her eyes, once alight with keen intelligence, acquired the vacant stare of a subjugated creature. George had successfully executed his plan. He had wed Caroline Norton and effectively rendered her invisible. In her place stood a hollow automaton, performing prescribed actions: awaken, dress as instructed, speak only when addressed, submit when required, sleep and repeat. The spectral residue of Caroline Norton learned to exist without being seen within her own home. Yet specters have a propensity to return and torment their perpetrators. And when Caroline dared to resist, she discovered that Victorian law had anticipated even that contingency. The judge raised his thumb as if measuring fabric, not contusions. In courtrooms across England, this grotesque ritual was a daily occurrence. The rule of thumb. A husband was permitted to strike his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. Judges would literally conduct measurements, and defense attorneys carried thumb-sized rods as legal accoutrements. The precision was abhorrent, as if violence could be rendered acceptable through meticulous calibration. But what truly compounded its monstrosity was the rationale. This was not considered an extreme legal measure. Rather, it was deemed progressive, reformed, and humane. Prior to the imposition of the thumb rule, husbands faced no constraints whatsoever. Limiting the instruments of assault to thumb width was regarded by lawmakers as a merciful modernization. They congratulated themselves on their supposed restraint. The measurement itself was not the most egregious aspect. It was the underlying reasoning. Judges explained that wives, much like children and servants, require physical correction. The natural order, they asserted, mandated it. Women's purportedly inferior reasoning made violence a necessary pedagogical tool. Excessive beatings indicated poor character in a husband, but the absence of any physical chastisement. That suggested a negligent household manager. The quintessential gentleman understood precisely how much force was appropriate to employ. Caroline Norton experienced this firsthand. George's violence was administered in measured doses. He carefully avoided striking her face, as visible bruises might cause him social embarrassment. Her ribs and arms were preferred targets, areas readily concealed by customary attire. He was equally particular about his implements: his walking stick for significant corrections, his hand for the daily maintenance of order, always adhering to legal parameters. Hannah Colwick harbored the belief that the law would offer her salvation. She was tragically mistaken. In 1833, Hannah presented herself in court bearing 3 fractured ribs and a shattered wrist. Her husband had assaulted her with a fire poker, a clear violation of the thumb-width stipulation. The evidence appeared irrefutable. Witnesses had heard her screams, and a medical professional corroborated her injuries. The poker was produced in court and, when measured against the judge's thumb, was found to be half an inch too thick. The judge's response astounded even seasoned court reporters. While acknowledging that the husband had indeed exceeded legal boundaries, the judge demanded context. What provocation had Hannah offered? Her response sealed her fate. She had burned his dinner while attending to their ailing infant. This was deemed negligent household management. The beating, though technically excessive, was considered a response to a legitimate grievance. The judge's verdict left Hannah wishing she had succumbed to the assault. Not only did Hannah's husband face no penalty, but she was ordered to return to him immediately. More damningly, she was obligated to defray his legal expenses for his defense. The court further charged her with disrupting domestic tranquility through her complaint. The very fractured ribs that brought her to court now bore the weight of debt incurred in seeking justice. The ruling conveyed a stark message to every wife in England. The law existed to regulate violence, not to prevent it. Courts would penalize excessive force, but attempts to escape it would be punished even more severely. The thumb rule established a perverse equilibrium. Assaulting one's wife within prescribed limits ensured legal protection. Driving her to seek assistance, however, resulted in her return, beaten and indebted. Medical professionals were complicit in this system. Physicians developed expertise in distinguishing between legally permissible and actionable injuries. They compiled charts illustrating acceptable bruising patterns versus those that warranted legal intervention. Medical journals published guidelines for treating wives who had sustained domestic correction without involving legal authorities. The paramount directive was, first, do no harm to the husband's legal standing. The judge's verdict made her lament seeking help rather than accepting her fate. Some women devised inventive interpretations of their suffering. If bruises were inevitable, they resolved to ensure those marks were legally actionable. Margaret Thornton trained herself to fall in a manner that ensured contusions appeared on her face, a region her husband typically avoided striking. Elizabeth Marsh learned to emit louder screams during assaults with legal implements, hoping nearby neighbors might misinterpret the sounds as evidence of illegal violence. However, the majority learned simpler, more direct lessons. Silence ensured survival, while complaint invited repercussions. The law, ostensibly designed for their protection, effectively codified their torment. It was preferable to endure beatings within the thumb-width limit than to risk judicial inventiveness and subsequent punishment. It was better to heal in quiet solitude than to seek assistance that would only lead to greater hardship. Caroline Norton absorbed these harsh realities through her own painful experiences and astute observations. She witnessed George meticulously measuring his violence, like a craftsman refining his technique. She learned which bruises to conceal and which to attribute to accidental clumsiness. She discovered that excessive weeping suggested manipulation, while insufficient tears implied defiance. Even her suffering demanded a carefully orchestrated performance. The thumb rule illuminated the true function of law within Victorian marriages. Not protection, but calibration. Not justice, but systematization. Violence was not prohibited, merely regulated. Much like industrial standards for machinery, the law stipulated acceptable tolerances for the physical incapacitation of women, essentially establishing quality control for domestic abuse. Parliament occasionally entertained debates on amending the thumb rule, perhaps suggesting a 3/4-inch standard for increased humanity, or even proposing different regulations for various social strata. These discussions transpired in legislative chambers, where every member returned home to wives they were legally permitted to assault. The conversations bore the casual tenor of men discussing livestock management, which in essence was precisely what they were doing. However, broken bones eventually healed. What followed, however, was responsible for the demise of 1 in 30 women. Every pregnancy for a working-class woman was akin to playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets loaded into a 30-chambered cylinder. The statistics were stark. 1 in 30 working-class women perished during childbirth. For women who endured multiple pregnancies, 1 in 6 pregnancies resulted in maternal death. In the most impoverished urban areas, these odds escalated to 1 in 20. These were not abstract figures. They represented probabilities of execution, and Victorian wives faced them repeatedly, entirely devoid of any legal right to refuse. The stark mathematics of mortality became intimate knowledge. Women meticulously counted their pregnancies, much like soldiers tallied survived battles. The first birth survived, the second survived, the third survived. Each instance was a gamble, with dice heavily weighted by poverty, exhaustion, and medical ignorance. Ultimately, the house always won. The sheer numbers were terrifying, but the lived reality surpassed statistical representation. Death presented itself in various forms. Puerperal fever, a virulent infection that rendered women's bodies infernos, consuming them from within. Hemorrhage, the agonizing process of bleeding out while midwives desperately stuffed rags into wounds that refused to close. Eclampsia, sudden seizures that struck with the ferocity of lightning, leaving women convulsing into oblivion. Obstructed labor, a prolonged and agonizing ordeal where infants remain trapped in passages too narrow, leading to the deaths of both mother and child. Working-class women faced distinct horrors. They received no respite during pregnancy. Their arduous tasks of mining, laundry, factory work, and domestic service continued until labor pains commenced. There was no period of recovery. They returned to their duties mere days later, still bleeding and feverish. Proper nutrition was a luxury they could not afford, as pregnancy further depleted bodies already weakened by poverty. Medical care was unattainable, as the cost of doctors far exceeded the funds available for basic sustenance. Yet, more harrowing than the physical peril was the legal entanglement. Wives possessed no right to refuse their husbands. Marital rape was a legal impossibility. The concept of conjugal rights necessitated pregnancy after pregnancy, each one another spin of that deadly wheel. Women implored for a reprieve. Husbands exercised their ownership. The law consistently sided with the husband. For those women who survived, the only reward was the prospect of enduring it all again. Caroline Norton bore 3 children within a 4-year span. Each subsequent pregnancy rendered her weaker than the last, with each recovery incomplete before the next began. She watched her body transform into a birthing apparatus, worn down by relentless use. The woman who had entered marriage young and healthy aged decades in half that time. The disparity in survival rates between social classes created bitter ironies. Affluent women employed wet nurses, rested extensively in bed, and summoned physicians, effectively doubling their survival prospects compared to their poorer counterparts. However, wealth imposed its own set of constraints. Society expected aristocratic wives to continuously produce heirs, rendering their bodies veritable factories for the production of inheritance. Different pressures, but the same legal subjugation. Medical knowledge that could have saved countless lives existed, European physicians had identified the link between hygiene and infection and had developed techniques for managing difficult births. However, the British medical establishment resisted innovation. Why improve survival rates when suffering was clearly divinely ordained? Some physicians actively preached that labor pains were divine retribution for Eve's transgression, and relieving them was an affront to God's will. Furthermore, some women were compelled to confront these perilous odds while simultaneously performing strenuous labor. Women carried laundry while carrying their unborn children. They scrubbed floors on their hands and knees between contractions. They stood at factory machinery until their water broke onto the grimy floor. The confluence of arduous labor and the labor of childbirth created nightmarish scenarios. Sarah Mills delivered her baby in a textile mill lavatory, only to return to her loom to complete her shift. The supervisor deducted her wages for the 20 minutes she was absent. Each child tightened the snare of pregnancy. More offspring directly correlated with increased poverty. This escalating destitution led to worsened conditions for subsequent pregnancies. Consequently, more pregnancies raised the mortality risk. The situation devolved into a cycle of inevitable misfortune. Women witnessed this destruction unfolding, powerless to halt their own demise. Some resorted to traditional methods to prevent conception. These ranged from herbal infusions that might either aid or poison, to rudimentary barrier devices fashioned from whatever materials were accessible. Desperate pleas were directed towards any divine entity perceived to be listening. However, husbands who discovered these preventative efforts often retaliated with physical abuse. Preventing conception was viewed as a transgression of marital obligations. The prevailing customary law sanctioned punishment for such defiance. Caroline Norton observed friends succumbing to this reproductive demise. Women she remembered from girlhood were reduced to gaunt survivors, each day counting down to the next conception. Some endured 5, 6, or even 7 births before their fate intervened. Others perished with their very first child. All comprehended the grim statistics. All faced them regardless. The legal framework offered no alternative path. The societal structure perpetuated intergenerational trauma. Daughters witnessed their mothers perish during childbirth, acutely aware that their own futures held a similar peril, akin to a game of Russian roulette. They entered matrimony understanding that they had accepted a high probability of death due to pregnancy. The wedding night became a gamble with their lives. The marital bed, a slowly operating execution chamber. Victorian society cloaked this carnage in sentimental language. Motherhood was proclaimed as a woman's ultimate purpose. Death during childbirth was celebrated as martyrdom. The departed were considered chosen by God. These platitudes offered solace to everyone except the women confronting the stark reality. They understood the truth. Society had orchestrated their destruction through laws that effectively rendered them captive breeders. Envision the ordeal of labor, while forced to crawl on hands and knees in absolute darkness. The frigid dust mingled with the blood of birth as she propelled the cart forward. In 1842, the Parliamentary Commission on Women and Children in Mines brought to light conditions so horrific they shocked even the most hardened Victorian industrialists. The revelation wasn't the fact that women worked underground. That was common knowledge. The true shock stemmed from the discovery of pregnant women laboring to haul coal carts on all fours through tunnels only 18 inches high. During their investigations, the commissioners encountered women who had given birth within the mines, cleaned their newborns with chilled, blackened hands, and then returned to hauling loads. The tunnels were a mere 18 inches in height. Try to visualize that. Betty Harris, aged 37, testified before the commission. She had toiled in the mines since she was 6 years old, married at 17, and had been pregnant 12 times. She had delivered 3 children underground because her supervisor refused to permit her to leave her shift. She recounted crawling through passages so narrow that her pregnant abdomen scraped both the floor and the ceiling. The harness that secured her to the coal carts dug into her swollen physique. When labor pains began, she continued to crawl. The commission meticulously recorded her own words. "I have borne children down pit and brought them up best way I could." In complete darkness, she could not even see her newborn's face. The air was so noxious that the baby's initial breaths were poisoned, with no assistance available except perhaps from another woman hauling coal in proximity. Then it was back to the cart because the work shifts were not yet concluded and wages were essential. These instances were not isolated anomalies. The commissioners documented hundreds of women with comparable accounts. Jane Kerr delivered twins in a ventilation shaft. Mary Glover's child was born in a flooded tunnel, with the delivery occurring while she stood in knee-deep water. Sarah Gutter gave birth while lying on sharp coal fragments, as that was where labor overtook her. Each woman narrated her experience with a notable lack of emotion, accepting it as simply the course of her life. When contractions commenced, she could not cease hauling. The inherent nature of mining operations rendered pregnancy an exceptionally arduous undertaking. Women were employed as hurriers, essentially acting as beasts of burden, pulling coal carts. They wore harnesses around their waists and crawled on all fours, dragging loads weighing up to 500 pounds through the tunnels. This posture, on hands and knees with an arched back and protruding belly, was agonizing for pregnant women. However, the alternative was starvation. The harnesses themselves told a grim story, constructed from leather straps designed for optimal hauling efficiency, not for the comfort of human bodies, and certainly not for those in pregnancy. The straps dug into swollen abdomens, compressed internal organs, and restricted breathing. Women attempted desperate modifications, adding padding from scraps of fabric and adjusting angles to accommodate their growing babies. Yet these alterations diminished their hauling capacity, which in turn reduced their pay. Most women endured the discomfort without any modifications. The ambient temperature added another layer of torment. Mine shafts experienced extreme fluctuations, ranging from freezing to intensely hot. Women worked without upper garments, as clothing tended to snag in the constricted passageways. Pregnant bodies, already struggling with thermoregulation, were subjected to conditions that induced premature labor. Sweat mingled with a pervasive dust, forming a paste that clogged pores and poisoned the bloodstream. The infant's first breath would be a mixture of cold, dust, and poison. Newborns in the mines faced immediate perils. There was no access to clean water for washing, no sterile cloth for swaddling, and no fresh air for breathing. Mothers cleaned their infants using their own saliva, providing the only available clean liquid. They swaddled them in cold, stained rags torn from their own clothing. They nursed them with breasts blackened by dust, hoping the milk was not excessively contaminated. Some infants survived those initial hours underground. Many did not. The commissioners discovered tiny skeletal remains in abandoned shafts. Babies who had perished before their mothers could transport them to the surface. Women spoke of leaving deceased newborns in coal alcoves, marking the location to retrieve the body after their shift. Economic imperatives demanded they continue working. Grief was a luxury they could not afford. The most profound horror was the normalization of these circumstances. These women did not perceive themselves as unusual victims. Every woman in their community faced a comparable fate. Their mothers had given birth in the mines, and their daughters would do the same. This cycle seemed as immutable as the earth itself. When commissioners expressed their astonishment, the women responded with bewilderment. Where else, they inquired, were they expected to give birth? They worked 14-hour shifts, and babies arrived when they were ready. Betty Harris had 4 daughters, all of whom followed her into the mines, married miners, and continued hauling throughout their pregnancies. She watched them disappear into the same tunnels that had consumed her own youth. The family legacy was not inherited property or education, but the arduous experience of surviving childbirths underground and enduring subsequent deliveries in darkness. The 1842 report ultimately prohibited women from engaging in mine work. Parliament congratulated itself on this humanitarian act, but the ban plunged thousands of families into destitution. Women who had earned their own incomes, however modest, now became entirely dependent on their husbands. The very report that exposed their suffering simultaneously eliminated their source of income. This supposed liberation appeared as another trap closing. While these women perished underground, others witnessed their life's labor being systematically plundered, coin by coin. Ellen Woodhouse employed 20 seamstresses, but legally could not possess a single needle. By 1835, Ellen had established London's most successful dressmaking enterprise from humble beginnings. She commenced with borrowed thread and innate talent. Within 5 years, she was dressing the city's elite. Her workshop bustled with activity. 20 seamstresses, 3 pattern cutters, 2 shop assistants, and orders backlog for months. Clients implored her personal attention. She had forged an empire built on silk and skill. Then she married Thomas Woodhouse, and the empire was instantly transferred. Every garment she sold enriched his coffers. The sheer, cold precision of this transfer was almost unbelievable. The morning prior to her wedding, Ellen signed contracts, disbursed wages, and placed fabric orders. Her signature held significant weight. Suppliers extended credit based on her established reputation. Employees sought positions for the honor of being trained by her. She was Ellen Morrison, proprietor, creator, businesswoman. The morning after her wedding, she was legally unable to sign for a single spool of thread. All contracts she had previously executed now belonged to Thomas. All debts owed to her were now owed to him. Every asset, from her prized golden scissors to her client lists, automatically transferred. She could still engage in her work, still create, but she could not own. The law made that impossible. Thomas Woodhouse had entered the marriage with a clear strategic objective. He recognized Ellen's success and desired it. Not her, but her business. His own ventures had repeatedly failed due to poor investments, ill-conceived plans, and mounting debts. It was then that he noticed Ellen Morrison's flourishing shop. The solution seemed obvious. Rather than building a business, marry into one. The financial records told a story of acquisition through matrimony, a narrative that would unfold over subsequent months. Initially, Thomas adopted the role of the supportive spouse. He allowed Ellen to continue overseeing the daily operations. Why disrupt a successful enterprise? However, he controlled the finances. All payments were routed through him, and every expenditure required his sanction. Ellen found herself requesting permission to purchase thread for her own workshop, pleading to pay the wages of the very employees she had trained. The shift in power was gradual, but absolute. Thomas discovered he relished control. He began making decisions. That particular fabric was excessively expensive. Certain workers were overpaid. A particular client was deemed too demanding. Ellen watched him systematically dismantle the carefully cultivated relationships she had established. Suppliers began to disregard her and interact directly with him. Employees who had once respected her now deferred to him as the true owner. When she attempted to conceal profits, the real devastation commenced. Ellen endeavored to maintain clandestine accounts, siphoning off small sums. This was not an act of theft, but an attempt to safeguard her own earnings. However, Thomas discovered the hidden cash. His fury erupted like a volcano. How dare she pilfer from him? The money was legally his. Her concealment was a criminal offense. He asserted his absolute right to punish theft within his own household. The subsequent physical assault was legally permissible. The financial retribution that followed was even more severe. Thomas dismissed Ellen's most skilled seamstresses, the very women she had nurtured from their youth. He cancelled orders from her favored clients. He disposed of her specialized equipment to competitors at a fraction of its actual value. Each action was calculated to inflict maximum harm, and each was entirely legal. He owned the business. He had the right to dismantle it. Ellen attempted to appeal to reason. The business provided for both of them. Its destruction would lead to poverty for everyone involved. Thomas remained indifferent. He preferred to preside over ruins rather than share in prosperity. It was better, in his view, to captain a sinking vessel than to serve on a thriving one. The male ego demanded absolute dominance, even at the cost of collective survival. She watched her meticulously constructed empire disintegrate, transaction by transaction. The workshop that once employed 20 employees was reduced to 5. The client roster she had spent years cultivating vanished within months. Competitors acquired her trained staff and purchased her equipment at Thomas's distressed prices. Everything she had painstakingly created was scattered to the winds. When she attempted to shield profits generated from her own labor, friends urged her to comply with his demands. However, Ellen Woodhouse possessed the innate spirit of a businesswoman. She could not cease her creative endeavors. Working from their cramped apartment, she accepted discreet commissions that Thomas was unaware of. A wedding dress here, alterations there, payment often received in kind, food, candles, items that would not appear on any ledgers. She established a clandestine enterprise amidst the ruins of her former success. The statement preserved in the court records perfectly encapsulated her despair. "I have built an empire only to watch a fool destroy it, piece by piece." She uttered these words during divorce proceedings. When Thomas accused her of concealing assets, the judge ruled against her. The hidden earnings were deemed theft. The destruction of the business was considered his prerogative. The empire, it turned out, had never truly been hers. Ellen Woodhouse became a cautionary narrative, whispered among working women. Avoid excessive visibility in your success. Do not aspire to build too high. Anything you create can be usurped through marriage. It is preferable to remain inconspicuous and modest than to risk attracting a figure like Thomas Woodhouse. Marriage represented a gamble of everything one had built, dependent on the character of a stranger. The cruel irony was that marriage was intended to provide security. Instead, it guaranteed dispossession. Unmarried women established businesses fully aware that marriage would likely result in their forfeiture. They faced an agonizing dilemma: remain single and endure social ostracization, or marry and lose everything they had painstakingly constructed. The majority chose matrimony and witnessed their life's work evaporate. However, some husbands discovered more insidious methods of controlling their wives, employing scalpels as their tools. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown's waiting room was filled with women whose primary affliction was a desire to read. The year was 1866. Brown operated the London Surgical Home, a highly respected private medical facility. His clientele consisted of women from affluent society suffering from a peculiar epidemic: independent thought. Their symptoms varied, yet shared common threads: perusing novels, composing correspondence without authorization, voicing political opinions, declining marital intimacy, and expressing an interest in academic pursuits. Brown offered a surgical remedy for all these manifestations, a procedure he termed clitoridectomy. We would classify it as mutilation. He performed this operation on hundreds of women, proudly publishing his success rates, which he attributed to cures for epilepsy, hysteria, and the restoration of marital harmony. In essence, his claim was rebellious women surgically rendered submissive, their intellects excised with a scalpel. The procedure took 15 minutes to complete and irrevocably altered the course of their lives. Brown's medical rationale was rooted in a profoundly misogynistic ideology. He posited that female sexuality was the direct cause of mental instability. He believed that the reproductive organs were intrinsically linked to the brain. He asserted that sexual stimulation led to desires for intellectual engagement, which in turn fostered independence, ultimately culminating in madness. His solution was to remove the source of stimulation, thereby curing the madness, a logic as straightforward as amputation and as surgically precise. His patients were typically unaware of the ordeal that awaited them. Husbands would bring their wives to him, complaining of nervous exhaustion or hysteria. Brown would conduct a cursory examination, diagnose excessive sexual excitement, and recommend immediate surgery. The husbands provided their consent. The wives were not consulted. Within hours, they would be administered chloroform, rendered unconscious, and taken to Brown's operating theater. The clinical accounts detailed in Brown's own writings reveal the barbarity of these procedures. Women awakened to find themselves mutilated and in agony, with no comprehension of what had been inflicted upon them. Brown considered their confusion a positive indicator, signifying that the affected tissues no longer exerted influence over their minds. Pain was interpreted as progress, infection as a process of purification. Some women never physically recovered from the operations. All experienced profound psychological devastation. Upon regaining consciousness, they could no longer recall their former aspirations for freedom. Brown meticulously documented his successful interventions. Case number 48 involved a woman who wished to attend university lectures. Following the surgery, she exhibited appropriate domestic focus. Case number 73 concerned a wife who had refused marital relations after experiencing multiple miscarriages. Post-surgery, her conjugal duties were reportedly resumed satisfactorily. Case number 91 described a young woman who composed poetry. Post-surgery, she exhibited no further literary inclinations. Each case study represented a tragic account cloaked in medical terminology. Women who entered his clinic as complete individuals emerged as mutilated remnants. Their families often celebrated these transformations, viewing difficult wives as having become docile and intelligent women as having become vacant. The surgery achieved its intended purpose precisely as advertised, sacrificing the individual to preserve the perceived property. Brown also operated on children, girls as young as 7, brought to him by parents concerned about precocious development or unladylike behavior. He proudly recounted curing girls who exhibited a propensity for climbing trees or preference for books over dolls. The youngest documented patient was 5 years old. Her transgression was masturbation, a common childhood behavior, which Brown viewed as a precursor to female independence. Brown publicized his success rates in medical journals, framing them as triumphant announcements. Initially, the medical establishment readily endorsed Brown's work. He presented his findings at conferences, published in esteemed journals, and instructed other surgeons in his methodologies. The London Surgical Home became a destination for husbands with troublesome wives. Word of his procedures spread through drawing rooms and exclusive gentlemen's clubs. Brown had, in their estimation, discovered the definitive cure for female insubordination. His appointment diary serves as a testament to this reality. Mrs. J refuses household duties, reads excessively. Miss M harbors political opinions, unmarriageable. Lady B exhibits hysteria following husband's infidelity. Each entry represents a woman whose assertion of independence was pathologized as a disease, scheduled for surgical correction. Some women attempted to resist these interventions. Brown's records mention patients who required sedation prior to examination, women who implored him for alternative treatments, and wives who desperately pleaded with their husbands to reconsider. However, Victorian medical ethics offered them no recourse. Husbands consented to their treatment, and physicians dictated their fates. Their bodies became battlegrounds where male authority prevailed through surgical means. These procedures evolved beyond Brown's original technique. Other physicians developed variations, advocating for the removal of different organs or the severance of specific nerves. The underlying objective remained consistent: to enforce female submission through surgical means. Medical journals debated the technical aspects, much like discussions about machinery repair, debating which surgical approaches yielded the most effective outcomes, the optimal amount of tissue to excise, and the age at which the effects were most enduring. Upon awakening, they retained no memory of their prior desires. Ultimately, Brown overstepped even the lenient standards of the Victorian era. He began performing operations on women without obtaining any consent, not even from their husbands. He diagnosed hysteria in casual conversations and proceeded to schedule surgeries. The medical establishment finally intervened, not out of humanitarian concern, but because Brown had infringed upon property rights by operating without the owner's permission. He was expelled from medical societies in 1867, though his influence lingered. Other physicians continued to employ modified versions of his procedures. The notion that female independence constituted a malady requiring surgical intervention persisted into the 20th century. Women learned to conceal their intellects as if they were contagious symptoms, preferring to feign ignorance rather than risk the perceived cure. For those women who managed to evade his surgical interventions, another diagnosis awaited them. The symptoms of female insanity encompassed reading novels and holding opinions. In 1850, Dr. John Connolly published his definitive guide to diagnosing female mental derangement. The symptoms he outlined read more like a declaration of human rights. Excessive reading, particularly novels, an unnatural interest in politics, resistance to domestic responsibilities, an argumentative disposition, and a desire for education. According to Victorian psychiatric understanding, the very act of wanting to utilize one's mind was proof of mental decay. The diagnostic manual presented a list of common human thoughts and desires. Any deviation from absolute subservience could warrant commitment to an asylum. Wives who corrected their husband's grammar were deemed to exhibit intellectual pretension requiring treatment. Spouses who preferred books over needlepoint displayed dangerous masculine tendencies. Mothers who educated their daughters beyond rudimentary reading skills were considered to be afflicted with hereditary madness. The trap was ingeniously designed. Demonstrating intelligence was irrefutable evidence of insanity. Asylum admission records offer insight into the prevalence of this practice. Mary Wollstonecraft, unrelated to the renowned author, was committed for reading novels and neglecting her needlework. Elizabeth Packard spent 3 years in an asylum for disagreeing with her husband's theological perspectives. Sarah Stickney was diagnosed with political excitement after attending a suffrage rally. In each instance, the woman's perceived crime was thinking while female. The process for commitment was alarmingly straightforward. A husband required only 2 physicians to certify his wife's supposed insanity. Doctors, dependent on the patronage of wealthy men, rarely refused such requests. The certificates necessitated no evidence beyond the husband's testimony. Once signed, women could be transported to asylums immediately, without a trial, without an appeal, and without a voice. One woman was committed for correcting her husband's grammar in public. Within the asylums, the treatments were designed to shatter minds rather than to heal them. Prolonged immersion in cold water baths was intended to cool overheated brains. Isolation in darkness was employed to quell excessive thoughts. Restraints were utilized to prevent unfeminine physical activity, and forced feeding was administered to those who protested through hunger strikes. These treatments constituted forms of torture, all aimed at inducing the very submission that would serve as proof of a cure. Elizabeth Packard's account has survived because she eventually secured her release and initiated legal proceedings. Her descriptions are chilling. They called my love of reading a symptom, my questioning of scripture evidence of mania, my disagreement with my husband proof of insanity. The interventions were designed to validate their initial judgments, to drive me to madness through suffering until I displayed the very symptoms they had fabricated. Physicians developed specific therapies for educated ladies. Moral reform entailed enforced ignorance. Literature was forbidden, writing materials prohibited, and discussions limited to domestic matters. Women who entered asylums quoting Shakespeare departed unable to construct coherent sentences. The remedy operated by dismantling what it claimed to mend. The treatments were intended to shatter minds until the diagnosis became reality. Social standing dictated asylum conditions, but not the likelihood of admission. Affluent women resided in private facilities featuring gardens and music rooms. Their torment was mild, consisting of relentless embroidery, enforced quiet, and chemical sedation. Indigent women were housed in public institutions resembling correctional facilities. Their suffering was severe, involving physical restraints, solitary confinement, and meager sustenance. Both groups absorbed a singular lesson. Thinking was perilous. Some women learned to feign recovery. They embroidered with obsessive dedication. They readily concurred with every male viewpoint. They expressed dismay at their former engagement with literature or politics. They acted so convincingly broken that physicians deemed them healed. However, maintaining this facade demanded constant alertness. A single misstep, a flicker of their true personality, a spark of intellect, and they were returned to their confinement. The specter of asylum commitment loomed over every Victorian wife. Husbands wielded it like an absolute decree. It served as a perpetual threat, keeping women in line. Continue perusing those volumes, and I shall have you institutionalized. Express that opinion again, and medical practitioners will examine you. The asylum system did not require the confinement of every thinking woman. The threat alone effectively silenced thousands. Caroline Norton lived under this oppressive shadow. Her husband, George, repeatedly threatened her commitment. He asserted that her writings indicated mental instability. He claimed her refusal to yield demonstrated hysteria. He declared her attempts to see her offspring were manifestations of dangerous obsession. He arranged for physicians to assess her. They identified symptoms such as excessive literary output and an obsessive maternal fixation. Nevertheless, George kept the threat of commitment in reserve. He believed it was more advantageous to control her through intimidation than to forfeit his assets to an asylum. When their son fell ill, she was denied visitation, ostensibly to prevent a potential hysterical episode. The medical establishment devised elaborate justifications for this regime. They proposed that women's smaller brains were incapable of handling education and that their delicate nervous systems would fracture under intellectual pressure. They argued that reading novels overstimulated feminine emotions and that political contemplation masculinized female minds. Scientific discourse itself purported to prove that intellectually engaged women were inherently diseased. The genuine affliction, however, was dread. The dread that educated women might challenge their subjugation, the dread that intelligent women might resist their erasure, the dread that female intellect, if unleashed, could destabilize the entire Victorian societal structure. Consequently, they pathologized thought itself, rebranding intelligence as a symptom and transforming the yearning for liberty into evidence of derangement. The asylum system starkly illuminated the fundamental truth of Victorian marriages. Women's minds posed the ultimate danger. Physical bodies could be subjugated through brute force. Financial wealth could be seized through legal means. However, minds required distinct countermeasures, specifically medical interventions. The surgical approach involved excising organs. The asylum approach involved the excision of minds themselves. Caroline Norton faced an agonizing choice: confinement in an asylum or permanent separation from her children. George Norton understood the profound suffering that a mother could endure, a fate worse than death, life without her offspring. In the year 1836, Caroline uncovered the ultimate injustice of Victorian marital law. Fathers possessed absolute dominion over their children. There was no shared custody, no maternal rights, merely complete ownership. George could transport them anywhere, deny all contact, and weaponize them against her. The law unequivocally supported his position. Mothers had no greater claim to their progeny than they did to household furnishings, and in reality less claim, as furniture could not be exploited for emotional torment. The children's nursery remained precisely as she had left it that morning. George's timing was calculated. He waited until Caroline was visiting her ailing father. While she sat by her father's deathbed, George gathered their 3 sons, Fletcher, Brinsley, and William, and vanished. He provided no warning and left no forwarding address. Upon her return, Caroline found an empty residence and servants who averted her gaze. The boys, aged 6, 4, and 2, were gone. The prevailing law offered Caroline no remedy. She exhausted all avenues, employing private investigators to locate them, petitioning judges for access, and imploring family friends to intercede. Each attempt encountered the same unyielding legal barrier. Fathers owned their children absolutely. Mothers possessed nothing. George could conceal them indefinitely, and the legal system would facilitate his actions, which is precisely what he did. For a period of 2 years, Caroline remained unaware of her children's well-being. George moved them between various properties, meticulously guarding their locations. He engaged governesses with explicit instructions. No correspondence to their mother, no mention of her name. The boys were indoctrinated with the belief that she had abandoned them, that her love for them had ceased. The youngest, William, began to forget his mother's visage. George sent her locks of their hair, sans any return address. The psychological torment was meticulously calibrated. Periodically a parcel would arrive. It contained a child's drawing, a broken toy, or a piece of their outgrown clothing. Never a location, never a letter, only tangible proof of their existence somewhere beyond her reach. Caroline preserved these mementos as if they were relics of the deceased. In a profound sense, they represented the death of her maternal connection. Her children lived, but her motherhood had been effectively murdered. George's demands were straightforward: complete subjugation in exchange for continued separation. If she returned to him as an obedient spouse, she would be permitted to see the boys. If she persisted in her defiance, they would grow to adulthood without her presence. The choice was between servitude and ultimate loss. The majority of women succumbed and returned to their husbands. Caroline, however, opted for a different path. She resolved to contest the situation, a decision that necessitated profound personal sacrifice. George intensified his control. When 4-year-old William contracted scarlet fever, Caroline pleaded for permission to visit. George refused. She offered to enter disguised as a nurse, but this plea was also denied. She pledged to depart immediately after William's recovery, a condition George also rejected. For 3 weeks, her infant son battled for his life while she awaited any news. The fever eventually subsided, and William survived. Caroline never had the opportunity to hold him. When her son became gravely ill, she was forbidden from offering him any comfort. This separation inflicted torment upon the children as well. Fletcher, the eldest, retained clear memories of his mother and constantly inquired about her. George punished these inquiries. Brinsley developed a stutter that worsened whenever mothers were mentioned. William, the youngest, grew up with the conviction that mothers were mythical beings invented by other children. George had succeeded in orphaning them while their mother remained alive. Caroline channeled her profound anguish into action. She commenced documenting similar cases. Lady Mary Daring was denied access to her daughters for refusing to relinquish her inheritance. Frances Wright's husband sold their children to relatives in Australia. Martha Robinson resorted to disguising herself as a man to catch a glimpse of her sons at school. Hundreds of mothers endured a state of legal orphanhood concerning their own children. These accounts revealed recurring patterns. Husbands utilized children as leverage for financial gain, compliance, or silence. Refusal of marital duties resulted in the loss of one's children. Complaints of physical abuse led to permanent estrangement. Attempts to earn independent income meant the disappearance of the children. The law effectively transformed children into perfect instruments of retribution against their mothers, foolproof, unassailable, and devastating. George recognized he had discovered Caroline's breaking point. She could withstand violence, poverty, and isolation, but not this. Not the vacant nursery, not the silence where children's laughter ought to be. Not the unacknowledged birthdays, not the solitary Christmas mornings. He anticipated her capitulation. Most women endured mere months. Caroline persisted for years. When her son fell ill, she was barred from his bedside. Instead of succumbing, Caroline penned a powerful statement. The separation of mother and child became her weapon. She meticulously documented her own circumstances and those of dozens of other women, naming names, quoting statutes, and exposing the system that rendered mothers legal strangers to their own offspring. The pamphlet circulated through London's drawing rooms with astonishing speed. Women read it in clandestine settings. Men debated its contents in Parliament. The public reaction surprised everyone. Even conservative voices acknowledged a sense of unease. The utilization of children as instruments of control seemed un-English. Denying critically ill children their mother's comfort appeared excessive. Caroline had identified the system's vulnerability, its reliance on silence. Exposed to public scrutiny, even Victorians found its cruelty reprehensible. Her private suffering was on the cusp of igniting a public revolution. Caroline Norton seized her pen, this time to declare war. The year was 1837. For over a year, she had been separated from her children. The empty nursery echoed with phantom voices. The toys lay dormant, gathering dust. Yet Caroline had spent that year amassing something else: evidence, personal accounts, legal precedents. She had collected testimonies from dozens of mothers experiencing forced separation from their children. Now she would wield their pain as her armament. The pamphlet, The Separation of Mother and Child, was more than a publication. It was a legal argument articulated through profound human suffering. Caroline understood her intended audience. Male parliamentarians were unlikely to be swayed by women's tears, but they might be persuaded by arguments concerning property rights, social stability, and English tradition. She framed maternal access as a divinely ordained right, economically sensible and socially stabilizing, radical concepts cloaked in conservative rhetoric. Every word she committed to paper carried the risk of utter ruin, but what else could they possibly take from her? Caroline wrote with the precision of a legal scholar and the fervor of a grieving mother. She meticulously deconstructed existing legislation, demonstrating how it contradicted even Victorian ideals of familial sanctity. She cited judges who had privately expressed reservations about their own rulings. She presented cases where fathers had legally sold children, abandoned them, or exploited them for prostitution, all because fathers held absolute ownership of their offspring. The pamphlet's brilliance lay in its strategic restraint. Caroline never attacked the institution of marriage itself, nor did she generally question male authority. Instead, she isolated one specific injustice, maternal access, and relentlessly targeted it. This was not a call for revolution. It was a plea for reform, a minor adjustment to perfect the existing framework. Would allowing mothers to visit their children truly threaten the empire? George retaliated swiftly. He sued her for libel, threatened publishers of her work, and disseminated rumors concerning her mental state and morality. However, Caroline had anticipated these actions. Every fact presented in her pamphlet was meticulously substantiated. Every cited case originated from public records. She had constructed an impregnable fortress of evidence. George's attacks inadvertently amplified attention to her cause. When Parliament reviewed her pamphlet, an unprecedented event occurred. They paid heed. The public response was overwhelming. Women who had never spoken publicly shared their harrowing experiences. Mothers separated from their children for decades expressed their gratitude to Caroline in letters. Even some fathers voiced their disquiet. The image of English mothers being barred from nurseries disturbed the national identity. Were not English families purported to embody moral superiority? How could this be maintained if mothers were legally estranged from their own infants? Lord Talfourd introduced the Custody of Infants Act in 1839. The bill was modest in its scope, granting mothers the right to petition for access to children under the age of 7. It did not confer custody or inherent rights, merely supervised visits. If judges approved the petition, the father retained ultimate ownership. Nevertheless, for the first time in England's legal history, the law formally acknowledged a mother's connection to her children. The ensuing debate revealed the underlying anxieties. If mothers were permitted to visit their children, what would be the next demand? If wives possessed any rights, where would the erosion of male authority cease? One parliamentarian ominously warned that maternal access represented the initial fissure that would ultimately shatter the entire edifice of coverture. He was, in fact, correct. Caroline Norton had identified the system's fundamental weakness. Children represented the sole domain where female emotion could override male logic. The law underwent alteration, yet Caroline personally gained no relief. The Custody Act, though passed, contained a detrimental provision. Only mothers deemed virtuous could petition for access, and virtue was subjectively defined by the judges. George Norton had spent years systematically portraying Caroline as an adulteress, leveraging her friendships with male writers. No judge would risk granting access to a woman with such a notorious reputation. The very law she had fought so valiantly to enact effectively excluded her. Caroline had achieved victory in the broader campaign, but her personal battle remained lost. She had amended the law for countless mothers while remaining separated from her own children. The irony was as bitter as poison. She had secured for other women the very possibility she would never experience, the chance to hold her children again. Her sacrifice became their salvation. The cost of this triumph was everything. Caroline's reputation was irrevocably damaged. Her marriage was over, yet divorce was legally unattainable. Her children remained beyond her reach. Her writing career suffered due to the scandal. She subsisted in genteel poverty, relying on minor commissions and the charity of relatives. Society ostracized her, viewing her as a cautionary example, a testament to the consequences for women who dared to resist. The law had changed, but Caroline herself would never benefit from this progress. However, Caroline Norton possessed a crucial understanding. Individual triumph was secondary to systemic transformation. Every mother who regained access to her children served as a validation of Caroline's sacrifice. Every erosion of coverture could be traced back to her courage. She had demonstrated the unthinkable, that Victorian law was mutable, that women's suffering could be transmuted into political influence, and that the established order was not impregnable. She lived to witness further advancements. the Married Women's Property Act, the Matrimonial Causes Act. Each reform built upon the foundations she had painstakingly laid. Male legislators who had vehemently condemned her in 1839 cited her arguments with respect in 1870. The woman once condemned as dangerous became an influential figure. History vindicated what society had condemned. Caroline Norton passed away in 1877. Her gravestone bears an epitaph she personally selected, "No longer a slave." The woman who had irrevocably signed away her existence in 1827 had spent the ensuing 50 years reclaiming it, not through subservience, but through defiance, not by accepting the system, but by exposing its inherent flaws. Now, let us return our attention to that trembling hand in 1827 with the full understanding of what that signature truly signified. The pen poised above that marriage certificate in 1827 might as well have been the executioner's axe. We now comprehend what Caroline Norton could not grasp in that moment. Each stroke of her pen was a decree of her civil demise. The letter C that initiated Caroline's name marked the cessation of her legal existence. The N that began Norton signified her transformation into mere property. That signature, intended to formalize a union of love, instead sealed her fate as an invisible entity within her own life. The wedding vows themselves assume a sinister connotation when their true meaning is understood. To have and to hold signified literal ownership. To honor and obey mandated absolute submission or the threat of legal retribution. Till death do us part implied until her civil death became literal. The assembled congregation witnessing those vows were not celebrating a marriage. They were attending a legal funeral for a person compelled to remain sentient. Caroline's spectral presence stands beside every Victorian bride, whispering the true implications of those seemingly innocuous words. Consider the somber realities of that day. Her father literally gave her away, transferring ownership from one male custodian to another. The pristine white gown she wore symbolized the unblemished slate she was expected to become. The veil obscuring her face represented the shroud of coverture that would soon erase her very identity. Even the wedding ring itself functioned as a manacle disguised as adornment. Every tradition was imbued with the encoding of ownership. The wedding night that followed was not a commencement, but a conclusion. The end of Caroline Norton as a legal entity. The termination of her right to possess property, execute contracts, or refuse consent. The end of her voice in any meaningful capacity. She retired to bed as a human being and awoke as a chattel. The consummation of the marriage consecrated her civil death. Yet herein lies the revolutionary aspect of Caroline Norton's narrative. She refused to remain deceased. That phantom haunting her own existence resolved to haunt the very system that had extinguished her. She transformed the suffering intended to silence her into words that could not be disregarded. She rendered her personal torment a source of political power. She proved that civil death was not necessarily an immutable state. The legislative breaches that evolved into societal chasms originated from her unwavering refusal to vanish silently. The Custody of Infants Act she championed was merely the initial step. Every fissure in coverture could be traced back to women like Caroline who rejected their erasure. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870, granting women the right to retain their earnings, and the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, permitting divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty, and the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, bestowing property rights. Each reform built upon the preceding one, and each was unattainable without the initial breakthrough. These were not ancient victories. Your great-great-grandmother lived under these very laws. Upon her marriage, she legally ceased to exist. Your great-grandmother may have been the first woman in your family lineage to legally possess property post-marriage. Your grandmother might have been the first woman in your family who could refuse her husband without facing the threat of institutionalization. This is not distant history. It is familial history. The spectral remnants of these legal extinguishments still resonate with us. Every woman who inscribes her name on a marriage certificate does so with the same hand that Caroline Norton used. However, today, that signature establishes a partnership, not a transaction. Today, those vows signify love, not legal obligation. Today, that ring symbolizes union, not subjugation. The transformation from property to personhood spanned centuries and involved countless individuals like Caroline Norton. Let us conclude with her epitaph, "No longer a slave." These words reverberate through every modern marital union. Caroline Norton passed away in 1877, 50 years after that hesitant signature. She had outlived the husband who subjected her to torture. She had witnessed her children grow into strangers. She had observed the laws that had enslaved her begin to dismantle. On her gravestone, she insisted on 5 simple words. Caroline Norton, no longer a slave. Not wife, not mother, not property, but simply a woman who refused to remain legally deceased. Every contemporary bride signs her name freely because Caroline Norton signed hers in subjugation and subsequently fought to break those chains. Every mother who embraces her children does so because Caroline Norton lost hers and made that loss profoundly significant. Every woman who owns property, earns income, or exists as an independent legal entity does so because women such as Caroline Norton resolutely rejected the permanence of civil death. The pen that inscribed the marriage certificate in 1827 became the instrument that rewrote English law. The hand that trembled with youthful uncertainty grew steady with the clarity of purpose. The woman who entered that church as an individual and departed as property spent 50 years demonstrating that legal extinction could not vanquish that which refused to die. Such is the true terror and the enduring hope embodied by the Victorian wedding night. It gave rise to spectres who learned to haunt their tormentors, and, ultimately, those spectres instigated change.